For 40 years, Emily thought she had the perfect marriage, until one unexpected discovery shattered everything. A letter, a hidden notebook, and a truth so devastating she couldn't escape it. In this video, you'll hear the shocking details of the betrayal that turned her world upside down, and the moment that changed everything. You won't believe what happens next. This is a story you can't miss. For 40 years, Emily believed she had the kind of marriage that others could only dream of. She and her husband, David, built their life from scratch, working hard and supporting each other through every challenge. Together, they raised 2 children, created a beautiful home, and weathered the ups and downs of life. Their partnership seemed unbreakable, and David's steady presence had always been Emily's anchor. Emily often reflected on how lucky she was. Every anniversary, David would remind her of the first day they met, and every morning he kissed her on the forehead before heading off to work. He was kind, reliable, and devoted, or so she thought. They were each other's closest confidants, the type of couple that finished each other's sentences and laughed over shared memories late into the night. Emily had never doubted him, not once in all those years. But the cracks were there, even if Emily didn't see them. There were moments when David would come home later than usual, citing work obligations. His phone, always on silent, was something he rarely left unattended. Emily chalked it up to habit and shrugged off the idea of something being wrong. After all, David had been faithful for decades. Why would she question him now? Life continued smoothly, or so it seemed. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, a chain of events began that would shatter the perfect picture Emily had held onto for so long. It started with an envelope. Emily was sorting through the mail when she noticed something unusual. A letter addressed to David, marked personal and confidential. Normally, Emily wouldn't think twice about it. David often received work-related correspondence, and privacy was something they respected in their marriage. But something about this envelope felt off. The handwriting on the front wasn't from a professional sender. It was personal. Curiosity got the better of her, and against her better judgment, Emily opened it. Inside, there was a short note written in flowing, elegant handwriting. It read, "David, I can't keep this a secret any longer. We need to talk. Call me, Claire." Emily's hands began to tremble as she read the words over again, each syllable piercing her heart. Who was Claire, and why was she writing to David with such urgency? Emily's mind raced with possibilities. At first, she wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, perhaps a message from a colleague or an old friend. But deep down, a sinking feeling took hold of her, a feeling she couldn't shake. For the rest of the day, she struggled to maintain her composure. She tried to push the letter out of her mind, but it lingered like a shadow, whispering doubts into her thoughts. That evening, as David returned home, Emily found herself observing him in a way she hadn't before. His easy smile and casual demeanor felt suddenly foreign. When she asked him about his day, he answered quickly, without looking her in the eye. The letter sat tucked away in her drawer, its presence growing heavier with every passing second. Emily didn't confront him. Not yet. She needed more answers before she could bring herself to face what this might mean. Over the next few days, Emily began to pay closer attention to David's habits. She noticed how he seemed more distracted during their conversations, how he'd step outside to take phone calls instead of answering them in the kitchen like he used to. Her suspicions deepened when she found his calendar unusually clear for the following weekend, even though he'd mentioned being busy at work. David had never lied to her before, or so she believed, but now Emily couldn't be sure of anything. Emily decided she had to know the truth, even if it hurt. The trust that had taken 40 years to build was beginning to crumble, and she wasn't going to let it happen without understanding why. She didn't know it yet, But this was only the beginning of an unraveling that would turn her world upside down. Emily couldn't sleep that night. Her mind churned with questions and scenarios, each one more painful than the last. Was David hiding something? And if he was, how long had this been going on? She told herself she needed proof, something undeniable to confirm her growing suspicions. Her heart ached at the thought of betraying David's trust by prying, but the doubt had grown too loud to ignore. She had to act. The next morning, after David left for work, Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone sitting on the counter. David was unusually careful with it, never leaving it behind. Today, however, he seemed to have forgotten it in his rush out the door. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for it. She felt a pang of guilt. 40 years of mutual respect, and here she was, about to break their unspoken rule of trust. But the letter haunted her, pushing her forward. Unlocking his phone wasn't difficult. Emily knew his passcode. It was their wedding anniversary. Her chest tightened at the irony. She opened his messages first, scrolling quickly through the familiar names of friends, family, and co-workers. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance. But then her eyes landed on a thread from someone named Claire. The messages were brief, almost clinical, as if they'd been written with caution. "Thank you for last night," one read. Another said, "I understand it's complicated, but I need to know where we stand." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her world began to spin as she scrolled further, piecing together the cryptic conversation. There was no explicit mention of an affair, but the tone of the messages and the familiarity between them left little room for doubt. Emily's heart pounded as she opened his email next. She didn't know what she was looking for, but her instincts told her there was more to uncover. Buried beneath work-related correspondence, she found another email from Claire. This one was longer and far less guarded. "David, I can't keep living like this. It's been years, and I'm tired of waiting. I deserve more than stolen moments. We both know the truth, even if we don't want to admit it." Emily's hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the phone. Years. The word echoed in her mind, a heavy, cruel truth she wasn't ready to face. This wasn't a recent mistake or a fleeting lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. This was a secret that had been carried for years, woven into the very fabric of their lives. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. The life she thought she knew, the husband she thought she could trust implicitly, now felt like a stranger to her. But even in her heartbreak, Emily felt a flicker of determination. She needed the full truth. No assumptions, no half-discoveries. She had to confront David, but she needed to prepare for what was coming. For 40 years, Emily had been the loyal wife, the forgiving partner, the steadfast presence in their marriage. But as she put the phone down and wiped her tears, she realized something had changed. This time, she wasn't going to sit quietly and accept whatever story David decided to tell. This time, she was going to fight for herself. By the time David came home that evening, Emily had already rehearsed every word she planned to say. She waited for him in the living room, her heart pounding, but her face calm. The phone lay on the coffee table between them, a silent witness to the storm that was about to unfold. When David walked in, he greeted her with his usual warmth, but Emily didn't return his smile. "David," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "We need to talk." David froze, sensing the weight in her tone. He glanced at the phone on the table, and for the first time in their marriage, Emily saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Fear. It was fleeting, quickly masked by his usual composure, but it was enough to confirm what Emily already knew. "What's wrong?" he asked, feigning concern. Emily picked up the letter, now folded neatly in her lap, and handed it to him. "This came in the mail yesterday." David's face drained of color as he read the note. His hands trembled slightly, and for a moment Emily thought he might try to deny it. But instead, he let out a long, shaky breath and sat down across from her. "Emily," he started, his voice quiet and filled with something that almost resembled regret. "I can explain." "Explain?" Emily's voice rose, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "Explain what, David? That you've been lying to me? That you've had her, Claire, in your life for years while I sat here trusting you?" David's shoulders slumped. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. Emily felt her anger flare. "Wasn't supposed to be like this? Then how exactly was it supposed to be, David? Do you think I wouldn't find out? That you could live two lives forever?" David finally looked up, his eyes glistening with tears. "Emily, it was a mistake. I was lonely and it happened. But it doesn't change how much I love you." Emily laughed bitterly, a sound that felt foreign even to her own ears. "Lonely? We've built an entire life together, David. We've raised children, shared dreams, celebrated every milestone. How could you be lonely in a life we built as partners?" David tried to reach for her hand, but Emily pulled away. "It wasn't like that," he pleaded. "Claire, it was complicated. She meant something to me, but it's not what you think." "Not what I think," Emily shot back. "You've been hiding this for years. Did she mean enough for you to risk everything we've built? Was she worth it, David?" David's silence was deafening. Emily stared at him, searching for any sign of the man she thought she knew. But all she saw was a stranger, someone who had carried this betrayal for years while looking her in the eye every day. Tears filled her own eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You've destroyed us, David," she said, her voice breaking. 40 years of marriage, of trust, of love, gone. How could you do this to me, to us?" David reached for her again, desperation in his movements. "Emily, I made a mistake. I was weak, but I need you to believe me when I say it's over. It's been over for a while. I didn't know how to tell you." Emily stood, shaking her head. "You didn't know how to tell me? That's your excuse? You had years to tell me the truth, and instead, you let me live a lie. I gave you my whole life, David, and you chose to break it." The room fell into a heavy silence. David hung his head, and Emily turned away, unable to look at him any longer. The confrontation wasn't over. She knew there was more to uncover, more questions she needed answered. But in that moment, the weight of the betrayal pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. Without another word, Emily walked upstairs, leaving David alone in the living room. She didn't slam the door behind her. She didn't need to. The echo of her absence was loud enough. The next morning, Emily woke to an emptiness she couldn't quite describe. The house, once filled with warmth and the hum of routine, felt cold and foreign. David had slept on the couch downstairs, his presence a silent reminder of the fracture that now split their lives. Emily avoided him, moving through the house like a ghost. She didn't have the energy to confront him again, not yet. But Emily knew she couldn't leave things unfinished. The betrayal gnawed at her, demanding more answers. She hadn't checked everything the day before, and now a part of her wondered just how deep David's secrets went. When she was sure he was still asleep, she crept into his office, her heart pounding with equal parts guilt and resolve. David's desk was as tidy as always, his papers stacked neatly and his drawers locked. But Emily had lived with him long enough to know where he kept his spare keys. She opened the bottom drawer and found folders, receipts, and letters, all normal at first glance. But buried beneath them was a small black notebook that stopped her cold. The notebook was well worn, its cover scratched from years of use. Emily hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling. Inside were pages filled with David's handwriting, appointments, reminders, and names. But as she flipped through, one name appeared again and again: Claire. Her eyes scanned the entries, her breath catching with every word. There were dates and notes, brief mentions of dinners, trips, and meetings. Emily's stomach churned as she realized these weren't fleeting encounters. They were deliberate, planned moments. The affair wasn't just a mistake, it was a second life. Then, halfway through the notebook, Emily found something that made her blood run cold. Written in the margins of one page were the words, "Promise to Claire, keep things quiet for the boys." Emily stared at the sentence, her mind racing. For the boys? What boys? A horrifying thought struck her, one so unbearable that she almost dropped the notebook. Was David hiding more than just an affair? Was there a child? Her mind reeled at the possibility. If Claire had been in David's life for years, if they'd shared more than just stolen moments, then it wasn't impossible. Emily's hands tightened around the notebook as the realization settled over her. David's betrayal had already torn her apart, but the idea of him having another family, a secret family, was a level of deceit she hadn't even considered. She slammed the drawer shut and rushed back upstairs, clutching the notebook like a weapon. Her mind buzzed with questions she wasn't ready to face. Was she losing her sanity, or was the life she had lived for 40 years unraveling further with every discovery? Emily didn't know how she would confront David with this new possibility. She wasn't sure she had the strength to hear the answers. But one thing was certain: she couldn't stop now. The truth, no matter how devastating, had to come out. Emily spent the rest of the day in turmoil. She couldn't bring herself to look at David, much less confront him with what she had found in the notebook. The thought of him calmly living this double life, lying to her face while hiding something as monumental as another family, made her stomach churn. The man she had loved for 40 years now felt like a stranger, his every word and gesture a betrayal in disguise. As the afternoon stretched on, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Clutching the notebook, she walked downstairs where David was sitting at the dining table, staring at his coffee cup as if it held the answers to his own guilt. He looked up as she approached, his face a mixture of sadness and dread. "I found this," Emily said, her voice trembling with anger as she placed the notebook on the table. "Care to explain what it means, especially this part?" She jabbed her finger at the words, "Promise to Claire, keep things quiet for the boys." David's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Emily's patience snapped. "Don't you dare sit there and act like you don't know what I'm talking about. Who are these boys, David? Are they—" Her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Emily," he began, his voice muffled, "I never wanted you to find out this way. I never wanted you to be hurt." "Hurt?" Emily laughed bitterly. "You've done nothing but hurt me, David. Just tell me the truth. How long? How long have you been lying to me?" He finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Claire and I, it started almost 20 years ago. It was a mistake, something I never should have let happen. But it wasn't just an affair, Emily. Claire, she has 2 sons. They're mine." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. "Yours?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You had children with her?" David nodded, his expression a mix of shame and regret. "I didn't plan for it to happen, but it did. I tried to end things with Claire so many times, but the boys, they needed me. I couldn't just abandon them." Emily's mind raced as the weight of his confession sank in. For 20 years, David had been splitting his life between two families, lying to her every single day. So, while I was here raising our children, while I was being a good wife, you were, what? Playing house with her? Pretending you had some perfect little secret family? It wasn't like that, David said desperately. I was trying to do the right thing for everyone. I never stopped loving you, Emily. Stop, Emily shouted, her voice shaking with fury. Don't you dare say you loved me. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to me for decades while building a life with someone else. You've made a fool of me. David stood and tried to approach her, but Emily held up her hand. Don't come near me, she said coldly. You don't get to comfort me. Not now, not after what you've done. The room fell into silence again, but this time Emily wasn't waiting for his explanations. She was done listening to his excuses. Without another word, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving David alone with the weight of his confession. Her mind was a storm of anger, pain, and disbelief, but one thought rose above it all. She couldn't live this lie anymore. The life she thought she knew had been shattered, and there was no going back. Emily locked herself in the bedroom, her sanctuary now a prison of grief and rage. She paced the room, the weight of David's betrayal suffocating her. Her mind replayed his words over and over. They're mine. The sheer audacity of it, the years of deceit, the hidden family, was more than she could bear. She couldn't decide what hurt more, the affair itself, or the fact that he had kept it from her for 2 decades, all while pretending their life together was whole and honest. Hours passed before she could bring herself to do anything. Finally, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the family photo on her nightstand. It was taken at their 40th anniversary party just a few months ago. In it, David stood beside her, smiling as if he had no secrets. Their children, now grown with families of their own, flanked them on either side. It was a picture of happiness, a moment she had thought symbolized everything they had built together. But now, it felt like a cruel joke. How many lies were hidden behind that smile? The sound of a soft knock on the bedroom door pulled her from her thoughts. Emily, David's voice called quietly from the other side. Can we talk, please? Her anger flared, and for a moment she thought about ignoring him, but she couldn't. There were too many unanswered questions, too much she needed to understand. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door just enough to glare at him. What could you possibly have to say that would make this better? She asked, her voice cold. David looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale. I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he began. But I need you to understand why I did what I did. Why? Emily's voice broke as she interrupted him. Why does it matter? You cheated on me, David. You betrayed me, and you lied about it for years. What could possibly justify that? David sighed heavily, leaning against the doorframe. I was a coward, he admitted. When it started, I told myself it was just a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again. But then Claire got pregnant, and everything changed. I didn't want to lose you or the life we'd built, but I couldn't abandon my sons either. So I thought I could do both. Be there for them without taking anything away from you. Do you hear yourself? Emily snapped. You thought you could have 2 families, 2 lives, without anyone getting hurt. Do you even realize how selfish that is? I know, David said, his voice cracking. I know I was wrong, but I was trying to do the right thing in the wrong way. I thought if I kept it quiet, if I kept the 2 parts of my life separate, I could protect everyone. Protect? Emily's laugh was bitter. You weren't protecting anyone, David. You were protecting yourself, and now, look where it's gotten us. David didn't respond, The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. Emily's anger simmered beneath the surface, but she knew there was one more question she needed to ask. "Do they know about me? About our family?" David hesitated, his eyes dropping to the floor. "No," he said finally. "They don't know about you or the kids. Claire and I, we agreed it was better that way." Emily stared at him, stunned by the depth of his duplicity. "So not only did you lie to me, but you lied to them too? You've built your entire life on lies, David. Do you even know who you are anymore?" David had no answer. He looked at her with pleading eyes, but Emily was done. "I can't do this," she said, stepping back and shutting the door in his face. She leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls of their home, once a place of safety and love, now felt like they were closing in on her. For the first time in 40 years, Emily felt completely alone. And for the first time, she realized she might have to walk away from everything she had thought was her life. The days that followed felt like a blur to Emily. Each moment was weighed down by the suffocating realization that her life, as she knew it, had been a facade. The man she had trusted more than anyone had lied to her for decades, and the home they built together now felt like an elaborate stage for a cruel performance. Every room, every piece of furniture, held memories that were now tainted by betrayal. David tried to reach out to her, but Emily avoided him. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, let alone speak. She spent hours sitting alone in their bedroom, the notebook still clutched in her hands like a weapon. The pages blurred together as her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How had she missed this? Were there signs she had ignored, moments when the truth had been right in front of her? She thought back to the small things, the late nights at the office, the business trips that had seemed routine, the phone calls he'd taken outside. She had dismissed them all as normal, trusting that David, the man she had shared her life with, would never betray her. But now each memory felt like a warning she had failed to heed. Emily wasn't the only one struggling. Their children, Sarah and Luke, had noticed the tension in the house and reached out to her, worried. But Emily couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. How could she shatter their image of their father, the man they had looked up to their whole lives? For now, she told them she and David were working through some issues, but her voice betrayed the deep cracks beneath the surface. On the third day, Emily finally broke. She couldn't keep the storm bottled up any longer. She needed to speak to someone, to share the unbearable weight that was crushing her. She called her closest friend, Linda, who had been by her side since college. "Linda," Emily said, her voice cracking as soon as she heard her friend's familiar tone. I need you." Within an hour, Linda was at her door, wrapping Emily in a tight embrace. For the first time in days, Emily let herself cry, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to pour out everything she had been holding back. Linda didn't ask questions. She simply held Emily until the tears slowed. When Emily finally spoke, the words came tumbling out in a rush. She told Linda everything, the letter, the notebook, the confession. Every detail spilled out, leaving her raw and exposed. Linda listened in stunned silence, her face a mix of sympathy and fury. "Emily," she said softly, "I don't even know what to say. I can't believe David. After all these years." "Neither can I," Emily whispered. "I feel like my whole life has been a lie. I don't even know who I am anymore." Linda grabbed her hands firmly. "You are Emily. You are strong and kind and loyal. David's choices don't define you. He's the one who lied, not you. Don't let his betrayal take away who you are." Emily nodded, though her tears continued to flow. Linda's words gave her a flicker of hope, a small reminder that she was more than this betrayal. But even with Linda's support, Emily knew she wasn't ready to move forward. Not yet. There was still one more question that needed answering, one truth she couldn't avoid. What was she going to do about David? For 40 years she had been his wife, his partner, his confidant. But now the foundations of their marriage were gone, replaced by lies and deceit. Could she ever rebuild? Or was it time to walk away for good? Emily didn't know the answer yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Her decision would change everything. It had been a week since Emily's confrontation with David, and every day felt like an eternity. She had come to a painful conclusion. She couldn't live like this. The trust that had been shattered was something she could never fully rebuild. The weight of the lies hung heavy over her, a constant reminder that the foundation of her life was built on deceit. David, for all his pleading and apologies, couldn't undo what had been done, and Emily knew deep down that forgiveness, while possible, would never be enough to repair the damage. She spent her days in a haze, her body functioning mechanically, while her mind spun endlessly with conflicting thoughts. She had spent years devoted to this man, to their family, to the life they had built. But now she found herself wondering who she was without him. Did she even know herself anymore? On the 8th day after the confrontation, David came home early from work. He stood in the doorway looking worn and defeated. "Emily," he began, his voice tentative. "We need to talk. I don't want to lose you." Emily barely looked up from the letter she had been reading, pretending to give him the same attention she had given him for all those years. None. It had been a silent battle between them for days. David had tried to talk to her countless times, each time leaving with nothing but a few more words of regret and guilt. But nothing had changed. She couldn't keep pretending. "David," Emily said quietly, putting down the letter, "I don't know if there's anything left to say." He stepped closer, his eyes desperate. "Please, just let me explain one more time. I made mistakes, huge mistakes. But I love you, Emily. I never wanted to hurt you." She turned to face him then, her eyes cold and unforgiving. "Do you think I care about your excuses, David? You don't get to use your love as a shield for your actions. You've lied, you've betrayed me. And for what? To live some secret life? Do you really think I can just forget all of this because you love me?" David was silent, his shoulders slumping as the truth of her words sank in. Emily's heart twisted in pain. This wasn't what she wanted, but this was the reality of what she had been left with. "I thought I knew who you were. I thought we had something real. But this isn't love. This is manipulation." Tears filled David's eyes, but Emily was unmoved. "You've made your choices and now I have to make mine," she said firmly, standing up and facing him. "I can't keep living in this lie, David. I can't stay here anymore." David reached out for her, but Emily took a step back, holding up a hand to stop him. "Number, you've had all the time in the world to fix this and you chose not to. So," she was taking control of her life, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like herself again. The days after Emily left were filled with a quiet that felt both heavy and peaceful. She stayed with Linda for a few weeks, a temporary refuge from the storm that had wrecked her life. The transition was jarring, moving from a home filled with memories to a small guest room in a friend's house. It was a new kind of loneliness, but it also gave Emily the space she needed to think, to breathe, and to rebuild. Every day was an emotional battle. She spent hours reflecting on the past, trying to make sense of everything. There were moments when she wanted to go back, when the thought of her family, her children, her life with David, pulled at her heart. But then she remembered the lies, the secrets, the years spent in the shadow of betrayal. The truth was undeniable. Emily couldn't go back to a life built on lies, no matter how much she had loved him. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, her daughter. "Mom, I miss you. We're all waiting for you to come home." Emily stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a reply. "I'm not ready yet, but I promise I will be soon." She put the phone down and leaned back, letting the warm sun wash over her face. Slowly, the weight of her decision began to lift. She wasn't running away. She was moving toward something better, toward a future where she could be whole again, where she could define her own happiness. It was a process, of course. The first few weeks without David felt like a constant pull in two directions. She still loved him in some way, still grieved for the man she thought he was, but she had also begun to rediscover herself, to remember the parts of her that had been neglected over the years. She started walking every morning, getting back into reading, and even taking up hobbies she'd long forgotten. Slowly, she was reclaiming her independence, piece by piece. David called her several times, begging for a chance to talk. Each time, Emily ignored the call, not because she didn't care, but because she wasn't ready to hear his voice again. Not yet. She needed more time to heal. He had broken her heart, and she couldn't let him back in until she knew for sure that she could trust him again, and that she could trust herself. Finally, after a month of quiet reflection, Emily felt ready to face her children. She had been avoiding them, not wanting to share the full truth about David. She didn't want to tear apart the image of their father, even though they had already started to sense the strain between their parents. The time had come to be honest, not just with them, but with herself. When she sat down with Sarah and Luke, they listened intently as she explained everything: the affair, the years of deceit, the reason she had left. Their reactions were a mixture of shock, anger, and sadness. But Emily was relieved to see that they didn't blame her. They understood. They supported her. And for the first time since all of this began, Emily felt a small sense of peace. A few weeks later, she met with David, though not with the intention of reconciliation. She had made it clear that she needed to move on, but she also knew she needed closure. They met at a quiet cafe, and as they sat across from each other, there was no warmth in their conversation, no connection. But there was something important that was said. David apologized, not with excuses, but with raw honesty. He admitted how much he had hurt her, and for the first time, Emily believed that he understood the magnitude of his actions. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." She didn't reply immediately. She just nodded, taking in the weight of his words. Emily had forgiven him in her heart, not for him, but for herself. She wasn't going to let the anger and pain define her any longer. Forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about her own peace. As they parted ways, Emily felt a sense of finality. The chapter of her life with David had closed. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she would be okay. She had survived the worst, and now she was ready to rebuild her life on her own terms. Emily walked out of the cafe, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The journey ahead would be long, but she was no longer afraid of the unknown. The strength she had found in herself was enough to carry her forward. She didn't need to have all the answers right now. She only needed to keep moving, step by step, toward a future she could finally call her own.